Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Adelle Waldman.
Thanks. Thank you, CJ. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Wow, CJ is clearly taller than I am. So I'm going to read briefly because I'm really excited to talk to Marc Webb after. So I'm going to just be quick, but a few words about my book. The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. is a novel about a guy named Nate, and he's a writer, and he lives in Brooklyn, and the book is about his dating life. I guess some people in here probably read it. He's an all right guy. A lot of people have criticisms of him that are understandable. I'll talk more about those later. The section I'm going to read, though, is about his early years growing up in the suburbs. It's before he's become the way he is when we meet him in the book, when he's a sort of freelance writer in Brooklyn, doing kind of well professionally and dating frequently. All you need to know is that in the first chapter of the book, he's run into an ex-girlfriend of his on the streets of Brooklyn. The encounter doesn't go very well. It ends with her calling him an asshole and storming off. And this is chapter 2. Nate had not always been the kind of guy women call an asshole. Only recently had he been popular enough to inspire such ill will. Growing up, he had been considered nice. He was also a wunderkind of advanced placement classes, a star debater, and a fledgling songwriter whose extra credit homage to Madonna for Math Appreciation Week, like a cosine solved for the very first time, had, unfortunately, been broadcast to the entire upper school. Despite playing on the varsity soccer and baseball team since 10th grade, granted, his was a Jewish day school, Nate never quite achieved the reputation of an athlete. He didn't repel girls, exactly. They sought him out for help with bio or calculus, even for advice about their personal problems. They flirted with him when they wanted an ego boost, and then they told him about their crushes on Todd or Mike or Scott. He wasn't much to look at back then. Dark-haired and skinny, he had a pale, sunken chest that he felt made him look cowardly, as if he were perpetually shrinking back. Though he wasn't painfully short, he wasn't tall either. His hands, eyebrows, nose, and Adam's apple appeared to have been intended for a much larger person. This caused him to hold out hope, even as high school progressed, that he might spring up another couple inches, into the 5-foot double digits. In the meantime, though, these attributes didn't add much to his existing stock of personal charms. Todd and Mike and Scott were Nate's soccer and baseball teammates. Scott was the most popular guy in their class. He was tall and broad-shouldered and had that combination of crudeness and confidence that rendered intelligence not only irrelevant, but slightly ridiculous. A peculiar, if not entirely unamusing talent, like the ability to ride a unicycle. Todd and Mike and Scott were not exactly Nate's friends, at least not on terms of equality, but they thought he was funny. They also relied on him for help with calculus. Todd and Mike did anyway. Scott never made it past trigonometry. Nate went to their parties. Nate got drunk. Jokes were made about how funny it was that Nate, bard of the math department with the 4.0 GPA, was drunk. Meanwhile, Nate pined for girls like Amy Perelman, the stacked blonde siren of their class, whose bashfully averted eyes and modest smile were nicely offset by her clingy sweaters and ass-hugging jeans. Naturally, Amy went out with Scott, although one day she confided to Nate that she was worried about their future. I mean, what will become of him? Like, if his dad's stores, liquidated designer goods, don't keep doing well? My dad says they are, like, over-leveraged. But Scott can barely read. I mean, he can read, just not like whole books. But I can't see him doing well in college and getting a regular job. It just wouldn't be him, you know? In retrospect, it wasn't surprising that Amy Perelman, who was not actually stupid but only affected stupidity in her speech because that was the fashion, eventually ditched Scott and got an MBA from Wharton. At the time, however, Nate had, somewhat to his surprise, come to Scott's defense. He's a good guy, though, and he really likes you. Amy looked thoughtful but not quite convinced. I guess. Nate did have one admirer during high school, frizzy-haired Michelle Goldstein. It wasn't that Michelle wasn't pretty. He'd been interested in girls who looked worse, anyway. But there was something painfully self-conscious about her. While it should have been refreshing to see someone at their school engrossed in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Michelle's embrace of culture seemed a bit affected. She had an inexplicable fondness for the phrase pas de deux, which Nate had once, frighteningly enough, overheard her use in reference to her relationship with him. Still, at moments, he felt real affection for Michelle. One spring night, it must have been after a school play or concert, they sat together for hours on a bench outside the upper school, gazing down a grassy hill toward the dark expanse of the athletic fields. Michelle spoke, intelligently, touchingly, about the music she liked, moody female singer-songwriters with socially progressive lyrics, and of her intention to live in New York one day, to go off into the Strand, a huge used bookstore downtown, she explained. Nate wasn't sure if he'd even been to a used bookstore. There weren't any in their suburb, he didn't think. You should go to New York sometime, Michelle said. I've been. We didn't go anyplace like that. From his family's weekend in New York, Nate had photos taken by his dad of him and his mother huddled together on the observation deck of the Empire State Building. They wore newly purchased ponchos and smiled wanly while a cold drizzle fell on their heads. Michelle smiled sympathetically. In the light that spilled over from the parking lot, Nate thought Michelle's freckles and straw-colored hair were cute. He nearly reached out across the bench and touched her, her hand to her thigh. It wasn't even about sex. Nate's life had been somewhat short on friendship, real friendship, distinct from the sort of conditional alliance he had with Scott and company. Sitting on the bench with Michelle, Nate felt as if the two of them shared something, some nebulous, slightly melancholic sensitivity that made them different from their classmates. But at school on Monday, Michelle seemed to have reverted back to her other self. I can't believe you got an A on that test, she said after calculus. What a coup d'etat. She gave a little wave as she walked away. Ciao, Shuri. Coup, Nate wanted to shout. You mean just plain coup. Yet he and Michelle were constantly lumped together and treated as a couple. Scott repeatedly asked him if her cooter smelled like mothballs because of all the vintage clothes she wore. Michelle's ambiguous social status, neither cool nor uncool, apparently made her his female equivalent. They even went to senior prom together. Nate had been working up the nerve to ask a pretty sophomore, and he felt both resentment and relief when Michelle was asking him foreclose that possibility. On prom night, he thought Michelle might have been willing to have sex, but he didn't really try, although they made out. Well, more than made out, actually. He had a brief opportunity to assess Scott's hypothesis vis-a-vis the bouquet of her female parts. But Nate didn't push, because at that particular moment in his life, he didn't want to get entangled with a girl who was slightly repulsive to him. Nor could he imagine sleeping with Michelle and then blowing her off, the way that Todd or Mike might have. Although not Scott, who for all his crudity was sensitive and unwavering in his devotion to Amy. But there was something that rubbed Nate wrong about Todd and Mike's attitude toward girls, their implicit belief that whatever befell a foolish or unattractive one was her just deserts. Empathy they reserved for the best-looking girls. Amy Perelman's most minor setbacks, a B+ or a mild cold, elicited coos of grave concern. But by prom, Nate had largely begun to pin his erotic hopes on college, where he imagined even girls who looked like Amy Perelman would be smart and, more important, mature, a word he had lately begun to interpret as willing to have sex with him. If he were to list the biggest disappointments of his life, freshman year of college would be near the top, right behind the realization, much later, that even something as seemingly sublime as a blowjob, his penis in a woman's mouth, could be boring, even slightly unpleasant, under the wrong circumstances, or performed inexpertly. And I think I'm going to leave it there with this cliffhanger of these bad blowjobs, which do come up later in the book.
Well, thank you, Adele. That was awesome. Love the book. So now we're going to have Adele in conversation with Marc Webb. He's a film director you might have heard of. He made his debut with the two-time Golden Globe-nominated 500 Days of Summer, and most recently directed The Amazing Spider-Man 2 after helming the critically acclaimed The Amazing Spider-Man. Marc Webb.
Blowjobs. What a great way to segue.
I feel like it's always a good segue. So I wanted to say, I don't know, is this working? Does this sound okay? Okay. So I was thrilled that Marc, who I'd only met on Twitter, if that counts as meeting, agreed to do this, because I think I saw 500 Days of Summer when I was early on in writing this novel, and I was fascinated with the movie because it's a movie that's about modern relationships, and there are no car chases, there are no terrorists, there's nothing that doesn't happen in the course of ordinary life, and that's was what I was trying to do with the novel that then didn't only existed in part, but that I imagined, and I loved the movie, and I'm thrilled that Marc agreed to.
Well, that's very sweet. It's I loved your book. I'm not going to shower praise on you, because I think 500 Days of Summer it's a movie that we cared a lot about. But what you get to delve into in a novel, I mean, you can just get into a lot more nuance, and it can be more provocative. And it's gone. It's long gone. It's never coming back.
Oh, well.
So it was. I followed her on Twitter, and she followed me back. I was like, "This is so cool."
Which is nuts, because I'm like such an amateur on Twitter. I have like 10 followers. He has like 1 million. I'm exaggerating only slightly, but like, it's a big deal.
Twitter's a whole thing. Like, there's people who are really good at Twitter, aren't there? That's not a real novel thing to say, but I am not particularly one of them. I think there's a bunch of Spider-Man fans who follow me waiting for some news that they'll never get.
Right.
When really I just want to, talk about recipes and anyway. Chatting about relationships.
Okay, so one of the things, Marc said to me when we were having a conversation on Twitter and direct messages, he said he enjoyed the book, but he particularly enjoyed the conversations he had about the book. And we talked a little bit about, and he said they were contentious, but we didn't really go into the substance of these conversations until...
the book had come to me through a friend of mine who is a writer, and he's like, dude, you got to check out this book. It's kind of amazing, and it really gets inside of inside a guy's head. But it was written by a woman, and male authors have been doing that for forever. But it was he found this really profound and interesting. And then I found out, like, every guy I had talked to who's within a certain age bracket seemed to have read this book. And there was a lot of different varying accounts of it. And it was a really great sort of Rorschach test of what people felt about Nathan. I think a lot of people feel sort of harrowing, my friend said, he didn't feel like he was reading the book, he felt like the book was reading him, which really made me sad.
Right.
But I think there are pockets of real truth, and sometimes that made us all curious how you could do that.
Right.
Are you a witch?
Well, I have to say, no. But thank you. And one of the things I tend to get asked is, like, did you interview men for the book? Like, what was your research? And I have to say, with no offense to all the lovely men here in the room, that I did not interview men for the book, because I felt like the kinds of questions that I wanted to explore were questions like, why did you start dating this woman? You seemed really into it and into her for a while, and then you just lost interest, but nothing happened. Like, nothing really triggered it. I knew these guys. I have older brothers. I dated men. I married two men. I feel like if you ask a guy why, his answer would be like, I don't know. And sometimes they're really pained. I don't know. Like, feel really bad and unsure. So I feel like asking wasn't the way to go, because the questions I wanted to explore, they're not ones with easy answers. And what my method was to take sort of what I thought was stereotypically male behavior, like that, which that dynamic I described of starting something with enthusiasm and then it seeming to wane as the relationship gets more serious, or just little things like having a really good second date with a person and then not calling for a while. These are just stereotypically male things. And it's not to say that the men are the only ones who are difficult to date or do fucked up and
but in the book that's true.
Right. But I thought I would just take these external behaviors and try to come up with a rationale for why Nate would behave this way that I thought was fair to him, that wasn't like because he's a monster who wakes up in the morning thinking, how can I fuck with women's heads today? And so for me, I learned through the book. I didn't know all this before I started writing it. It was a process of trying to come up with a plausible rationale, something that rang true, that sounded right. It didn't sound like me, Adele, talking, but sounded like a guy talking, and then cutting all the rest. It also took me 5 years to write a really short book, so it wasn't very easy. I think it was something we were talking about earlier.
There seems to be a lack of coded language. Like everybody has different rules for relationships and different expectations. And certainly in 500 Days of Summer, that was a big problem. Is people, what Tom expected from Summer versus what she expected of him. What the culture has taught us by watching, mainstream romantic comedies or whatever, reading certain books. We're coached into believing into certain things which constantly fail us. And to what I loved about the book is that there was this. People are off. It's so like back in the 19th century, there seemed to be a more coded, specific way of dealing with people, of how people would evolve into relationships, and now it's it's the Wild West. Right.
I think the part of the difficulty with dating is that we don't have an agreed upon code for how to behave, and I feel like this comes up when I talk to people about the book of sort of isolating what does Nate do wrong. I get such a range of answers. Some people, a small percentage, honestly, would say nothing. Like, he's great. We should all emulate him. But there are some, I have to say. And then a few. But then versus people feel like there's something wrong with Nate. But talking about what is really enlightening, because it's not, they don't necessarily think what I think. And I think that we all sort of feel like there's something missing, that we want a world in which people behave more considerately, but we don't have some agreed upon formula for how to achieve that, or what that would look like. Just questions like, what do you owe someone? Say if you have 2 dates with them and then you're not interested in a third, do you need to then call the person or write them and break it off? Or is that presumptuous? And it's like,
that's what Twitter is for. Twitter is for specifically that event.
Yes, if we could all just agree to make
just
Twitter.
Tweet. Yeah. It is. It's hard. It's difficult. And in people, without intending to be cruel or inconsiderate, they become cruel and inconsiderate, or people feel that way. And I think Nathaniel is he's so aware and he's so thoughtful about everything, but there is this kind of a lack of empathy, I guess, isn't there? A lack of consideration,
right?
Which some people find. I in a weird way, I kind of envied how cool he was about everything, because he never gets hurt, he never gets wounded, he never has there's a moment of longing at the end when he's talking about having met Hannah again, which wouldn't it be nice to all go through life without feeling any sort of pain?
Right. And I think this is really interesting. We were talking about this a little earlier, that I feel like from Hannah's perspective, Nate really is that invulnerable. I wrote the book in part because I wanted to explore this type of male behavior, but I empathized with Hannah, who, for those of you who haven't read the book, she's a woman Nate dates for much of the book. And I think in a lot of ways she has more emotionally at stake in their relationship than he does. And that's that's frustrating and painful for her at times. But so in the course of that relationship, there's a way in which Nate seems invulnerable. And I don't actually think that all men are generally invulnerable, or that even Nate is invulnerable throughout his dating life. And yet, I think there's a certain truth there that in a particular relationship, one person might have more vulnerability than the other, and that is very consequential. That Nate, and sometimes the power dynamic is just self-perpetuating when one person feels the other one's vulnerability. It doesn't have to be the man who is the powerful one. And 500 Days of Summer is a great example of the reverse situation where it's...
Well, let me ask you a question. What did Hannah dig about Nathaniel? That he went to Harvard?
Well, if you're a cynic, I guess.
I mean, no, I don't know. I want to know.
I thought... I really wanted them to have a nice rapport early on. That initially Nate isn't particularly drawn to her until they have a few dates where they click, they laugh, they talk until late into the night. And I think for women that can go a long way, that sense of connecting on some sort of emotional, intellectual level. That I think she's not drawn to his relative professional success because he's a little more successful than she is. But he's not like some superstar. He's just a writer guy in New York. But he's got a book contract. She doesn't. But I don't think it's his success. I think she sort of genuinely likes their rapport and maybe is a little more hungry for that kind of rapport in her life than he is. Mm-hmm. Like he enjoys it, but he can clearly live without it as well.
Right. What is it? That's an interesting thing, and it's what's great about what you can do in a novel, and it's a little bit more difficult to parse it in a film. Is find the inflections in the tiny moments and talk about the tiny moments where people drift together and drift apart, because it's fascinating how that happens, how people fall for each other, and how people are having entirely unique experiences while being in the same moment.
Right.
You know, it's like even when you're in love, it's still different.
Right. And I thought for me it was really interesting to do this book where I wanted the reader to feel for not just Hannah, but some of the other women in the book, but to stay entirely in Nate's head. And that's a sort of neat trick to do it through dialogue, or in one case to have an email that was written that from Hannah's perspective, to try to convey that just because one person's experience is one way, that this is feeling completely different for someone else. We were talking earlier, this is slightly different, but it's related, but I loved it. In 500 Days of Summer, there's a sequence where Summer and Tom have broken up, but Tom goes to a party at Summer's house, and he wants to get back together. So he's imagining what's going to happen at this party, and you've got a split screen with it's called expectation versus reality, and in the expectation, he and Summer are chatting, and she's like looking up at him with big eyes and laughing. I'm like, oh, you're so... And it culminates with them making out, right? Or just being
on one
to.
side of the screen,
right?
On the other side,
on the
of
expectation side.
Yeah.
On the reality side, she is talking to other people, talking to another guy in particular, showing an engagement ring that is clearly coming from someone. He's not Tom.
Yeah.
And I feel like that, in that case, I guess that was a way of really, you're talking about Tom's experience. It's one person's experience, but the movie's about, it is about fantasy and how those expectations can motivate you, they can compel you, they can move you forward, they can be really wonderful. We want to live towards something, move towards something. But they can also fucking rip your heart out, right?
But again, it speaks to that the divergence between these. I'm confounded by it constantly, and it applies to things beyond romance, where you feel like you're having this shared experience, and there are moments where you can, but then people have their persona that they've conjured and cultivated, and you're interacting with a shell sometimes, it seems like, and then all of a sudden, even though you bear your soul, it's something that Nathaniel, and it's sort of the tragic part of his character, is that he's incapable, even though he has a great internal life, which sometimes I don't know if it's the author commenting on his psychology or it's his psychology itself, but it's like, it's this wonderful, rich, thoughtful parsing of details, but he never reveals himself to anybody. And I think that will make him, that's the tragedy of him in a way. I think he won't ever feel probably the I don't know if he's been seeking or craving that connection.
Right. I know it's tricky. I mean, I think there's something that there's maybe a novelist, like a trick of a novelist, or I made Nate be, I think, really observant and analytical about other people, in part because I thought that felt true to his character, but in another way because I thought that made the book more interesting to read. If I was going to be locked in his head the whole time, if he was a really like dense, unthoughtful person, like his thoughts wouldn't be interesting enough to hold the book. And I sort of told myself it has to all stay in his head. Like I didn't want to do a chapter from Hannah's perspective. It's just some of that seemed too easy.
It's exactly what we did at 500 Days of Summer. Was we restricted the point of view, and people kind of I think misunderstood it in a certain way, or it gave a very specific experience to the audience. And like I remember getting a lot of criticism after. It was it was people generally liked the movie, I think, but I remember all of us. It was written by men. It was, it was a bunch of dudes that came up with it. But we were like, there was this. Well, you were incurious about the inner life of the female. It's a term that floats around my head because it really hurt because it was like, because the reality is that's what the movie was about.
Right.
It was about his lack of understanding of that, and that's what kind of was the downfall of the relationship in some way.
Right. And no, and that kind of thing, I think I understand that hurts. I still remember this review from a small literary magazine, but it said of Nathaniel P. that it did women a disservice because Nate thinks all these critical thoughts about women, and that like I owed my next book to the sisterhood was the last line.
Whoa.
And I sort of felt like, did you think I was endorsing all of his thoughts?
Were they in Portlandia? I think they were in Portlandia.
But it gets to you when it's your intention, is to highlight the very thing you're being criticized for. But do you think that Tom becomes Nathaniel P. That it's like that Tom, he starts out, he's young, he's idealistic.
You mean after the movie?
Yeah, that like after a couple of relationships later.
Ooh.
Or is that too cynical?
No, I don't think so. I think I think he grows from it. I don't know. No, I think he is an uncynical guy and he's craving. He grows from that. He takes, and it's what you have to do when you suffer, is you build on that. You learn from that. You grow from that. Hopefully, if you have some good influences in your life, that's ideal. Madame Bovary gets all, she eats a handful and it doesn't work out for her so well. But there's no one there to she doesn't have a little sister who's wise.
Right. But see, I guess I'm thinking of Tom as a sympathetic, as a sweet, idealistic young man who, I guess my thought with Nathaniel P. is he was a little more like Tom when he was younger, when he felt like he had less power relative to women. Mm-hmm. And women were more unavailable, when he felt like the world was full of Summers who he wanted more than they wanted him. Mm-hmm. And then after being hurt a few times, as he got older, when he started to feel he had more power relatively, it, not a conscious desire for revenge, but and again, this is not an attack on Tom per se. I don't really want to tar him with the Nathaniel P. label because it's pretty,
he can
harsh
handle
one. But I think that, I guess, in some generic sense, I would just wonder if there isn't a trajectory that sometimes happens with young men who have less power relative to women being sort of sweet and then turning into monsters in their 30s. I mean, just a
I don't know
thought.
where you got that from. I think that's a very typical pattern where people feel. I mean, you listen. It's an expensive thing to get to expose yourself. It can cause enormous suffering, and you want to protect yourself from that. Absolutely, but like and it's not talked about or it's not explored that much in movies and literature, really. Love stories have a sort of the wedge between lovers is often like, I mean, in movies there's a high concept like, oh, he's dressed as a woman, but it's actually a man, and like there's like it's a kind of thing that a conversation can sort of defang the conflict. But I think that the actual difficulties of compatibility are much more difficult to explore,
Right.
And I do think that I mean, I think Tom. I think a lot of it comes down to having examples and having people around you who live beyond that, who are uncynical, and having like reading about books and having experiences, even if they're virtual, even if they're vicarious, where you don't surrender to a sort of more cynical attitude. Right. However, you don't also want to approach the world with a sort of naive response or naive expectation of what romance is. I mean, to me, when like Tom's relationship with romance was really laziness. Like, he just wanted this woman to come in and solve all his fucking problems. Right. But he didn't have a job that he liked. He doesn't fully actualize in any sort of real way. He sort of was stifled, and he just thought, oh, well, this girl, like, the theme of the movie, which we talked about, was like, happiness lies within, not in the big blue eyes of the girl in the cubicle down the hall. That was like kind of our mantra. And it was a guideline. It didn't come up in every scene.
Right.
But I do think that, I mean, it's a very important, difficult lesson to learn along the way.
Right. And I do think, I mean, to be clear, I sort of feel like I'm being a little provocative. I don't think the problems with relationships are due to one gender or another. That I think the deeper thing is compatibility, and it's also relationships are really hard. That there's the way that we live now, and which I think is by and large a better way than the way that our grandparents probably lived, where they got married at a younger age based on less information, and sometimes that worked out, but oftentimes it didn't work out so well. I do think it's better now, but we spend so many years of our lives having these types of relationships that just didn't exist for much of history, and then dealing with these breakups that can be devastating and painful. And yet I think as a culture we tend to treat dating as somewhat frivolous, as something for sort of romantic comedies that are fun and escapist, or sort of chick litty books that are also sort of escapist. But it's actually like quite a serious subject. It's a challenge that we spend years of our life dealing with, that have sort of deep emotional consequences. And I don't know. I do think it's. I don't really think that it's just like, God, men are such jerks.
So that's part of it.
That's just a part.
Yeah, women are too. We all are. It's gender non-specific. Should we take some questions? You guys have any thoughts, ideas?
As the mother of a daughter and a son in their 20s, one of the things I found most interesting about this was I saw for the first time kind of the stupid things women do. Like the girl who's known a very short time and gets pregnant and somehow expects that they're going to have, a 6-month transition period. And she sort of does the honorable thing, but they don't have anything going on between them. And I thought, I've seen that in my daughter's friends. But
Right.
I also thought, Nathaniel's young. And I wondered if you thought maybe he was going to grow beyond some of this. Like he's just getting some success, and maybe he won't be such a jerk in 5 years.
Right. Should I repeat that for everyone? Some of it. We're sort of talking about whether the women in the book tend to get maybe attached too quickly, or do expect too much from a man, and then that causes some of the problems as well. Whether Nathaniel P isn't the sole author of every other person's unhappiness. I'm paraphrasing. I felt like for me in writing the book, it was really, really important to be sort of unsparing about the women as well as the men, and because I felt like if I, as a woman, wrote this book where Nathaniel P is, a not terrible but flawed character, but if I made all the women these like beautiful, intelligent, wonderful, thoughtful, mature people, it just wouldn't ring true to the experience of men, and they would just say, like, this is just this bitter woman who's just, I felt like I wanted to present women the way I thought Nathaniel P. would see them, and it doesn't mean I endorse everything he says about them, but I think there's always some truth in his sense of being a bit suffocated, or the situation that you brought up with the pregnancy in the beginning where Nate runs into an ex-girlfriend who, and actually an ex-girlfriend is itself not probably the most accurate term. Someone he went out with, I think 4 or 5 times. She got pregnant. And I feel like it's a very modern situation. And she got an abortion. They both wanted that. But it's like, where does that leave them? What do they owe each other? What obligations are there? And I feel like that's very unclear culturally. It's just a strange situation for everyone. And I feel like it is strange for Nate. It's not like he did this for fun and is laughing at her. And I think it's complicated. I do have some sympathy for women for the women in this case. I guess I have sympathy for both women or men who are overly vulnerable at times. Like, I think we all might have a tendency to measure the right amount of vulnerability with the other person's level of vulnerability. So anytime someone is more vulnerable and gets hurt, we sort of want to blame them a little bit. We want to say, like, oh, but they expected too much, or they were too vulnerable. They should have been otherwise. Like I think we tend to want to side on the person with more power sometimes, and I didn't want to do that. Like, I think it's okay to sort of humiliate yourself a little. There's one woman in the book who writes an email to Nate that's like an email that everyone reading the book probably knows she shouldn't have written it, or she shouldn't have sent it. Writing it is fine. It's just not going to get the response she wants. Nate's not going to read it and be like, right, she's right. I now see the error of my ways. I want to go back and tell her, like, let's try this again, and this time I'm going to work harder. Like, it's not going to happen. She's just going to read it and be like, oh, God. But I have sympathy for her doing that. I feel like sometimes doing the thing that's not the cool, pragmatic thing is you can fall flat on your face, but we wouldn't want a world in which the worst possible thing was to be embarrassed by caring a little too much.
Yeah. I thought that was, I mean, that letter is it's an interesting moment, and I think everybody, I would guess everybody except for maybe you, have written a letter like that at some point more than I like, and sending that is completely inadvisable, stupid, but who doesn't, like, if you don't engage in that sort of profound stupidity, you don't learn from that. Right. And then and also like that I mean, that's Tom, the same kind of thing, and like it also makes you, there's something very truthful about it, weirdly, and like you got to, like, listen, that kind of behavior can become very dangerous, frankly, it can be a source of intimidation, and there is a very dark side to what can become obsession and stuff.
Right.
But that doesn't, I mean, writing a mean letter and telling him he was bad in bed is just kind of funny, and like,
right.
And like, you get through that stuff, and then when after you've done that, you're so embarrassed, hopefully, that
right.
you don't do that anymore.
Right.
There is an upside of shame. That's what I'm saying. Not really.
It's funny. I would say one of my biggest criticisms of Nathaniel P. as a human being, not that I actually think he's a real person, not something weird, is that I think that he just isn't, he thinks a lot, he has a conscience, he thinks about what the other person expects, and he tries to justify his behavior, but he's not always the most empathetic or the kindest, and in some ways it's related to the fact that he's not that vulnerable, doesn't have that much at stake. And I think something we were talking about earlier is that it felt like the way in which you feel like Nate was different from you is that in your dating life, not to bring it to that, but I think that you felt like there was more at stake. And I think that's true. I mean, I think one way in which Nathaniel P. does not represent men in general is I think and hope most men feel like they can relate to aspects of Nate, but also tend to feel like that there is more at stake, that this isn't a matter of indifference.
Yeah, he's never, and all men are different. There is no such thing as the universal. Like, there's only like particular people who have their own experiences and stuff. But there is this, I think a lot of men, thankfully, experience a sense of longing in their life, or experience a sense of being exposed or being hurt or being wounded, and that it can, like we were talking about before, it can unwind you. It can make you callous and cruel, bitter, or it can make you more empathetic. And he just doesn't seem to have risked that or had that experience, and it creates a kind of profound lack of tenderness,
right?
And which I don't think will serve him in the long run. You know what I mean? Like, I think he there will be a perpetual dissatisfaction. I think that's starting with the purgatory of Greer.
Right. I love that. I agree completely, which is not actually normally the case for me. It's one feels so protective of your own thing that you create, but I use the word tenderness often when I talk about Nathaniel P. Is that what I think he's lacking, and I do think it will come back to hurt him in this way, but it's not necessarily in this obvious way. Like, I didn't want to write a book where in the end all his ex-girlfriends gang up and kidnap him and just teach him the error.
It's a good movie pitch, by the way. Welcome to Hollywood.
Right. Something to keep in mind. Should we other questions? There?
I know there's been a lot of comparisons made to Jane Austen with the book, and I feel like that's a comparison that's made about any relationship book, but I've read it, and to me it rings true, because I feel like there's a precision to the way you kind of track every relationship in the book between every single male and female, and I'm wondering if that was a conscious decision at all, that you wanted to do something that's somewhat of a modern take on, just the relationship, sort of global look at relationships today,
right?
The way she did.
Right. I mean, I would say definitely in this one sense that I feel like what Jane Austen did is take what we call dating, what she called courtship, very seriously, and treat it in this way that you have to be. There are these people, but they're idiots who think Jane Austen is chick lit. Like, you're just missing so much of the wit and the irony and the nuance. And I feel like she just wrote serious, I mean, often funny, but in another sense serious books that took dating seriously, and that was very much an inspiration for me. I didn't want. And I in my 20s, I read a lot of 19th century books, and they're still the books that tend to be closest to my heart. That was a mixed thing when I set about in my 30s to try to write novels, because I didn't want to consciously imitate a 19th century novelist in this way that would just sound pretentious and ridiculous, like to use that language. We live differently. I wanted to write a novel in which the characters have sex with each other, and that doesn't mean that they're prostitutes, and and to speak like contemporary people, but I mean, thank you for that question, because I'm deeply flattered by that, because what I did want was to write seriously about a subject that I feel like it's worth writing seriously about.
I completely adore the book. I just started reading it like 2 days ago, and I love it.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome. Is it in talks to be made into a movie?
Yes. I think there are people probably in the room who actually could speak to it better than I can. I have to say I empathize with the screenwriter, because I think it would be a huge challenge, because the book is really internal in a lot of ways. It's all in Nate's head, and I have such respect for what you do. I mean, one of the reasons I love that sequence in 500 Days of Summer with the expectations versus reality is it's just a clever way to use the tools that film offers to just convey something sort of rich and interesting and psychological. And I feel like I can't even admit, I could never write the screenplay. It took me 5 years to write the novel version, and I did have access to the characters' thoughts, but yeah, it'll
be a tricky adaptation. There's a podcast, the BAFTA podcast. I don't know if you guys have heard it, but Charlie Kaufman was talking about adapting different kinds of novels, and he talked a little bit about how tricky that is, and he talked a lot about internal life, but it's kind of impossible in some ways to conjure a specific idea of what's going on inside somebody's head, because you're interpreting it through people's behavior and facial, and it means so many different things to different people, and it can get reductive really quickly.
Right.
It's just a different experience.
Right, and I tend to think like some of this book, like the most climactic moments. This is going to make the book sound really boring for those of you who haven't read it, but they're these really small things, like Nate thinking critically about his girlfriend's like arms, and it's like a profoundly disturbing moment, I think, when you read it, but nothing happens. He doesn't say anything. He just thinks this mean thought about the person he's with, and I'm like, yeah, good luck translating that. I guess the camera could pan in on her arms, but that wasn't really mean. I don't know.
But then, it takes out the elegant kind of, the nature of the how quickly it molds from one thought into another, and
right, because he thinks the thought and then feels guilty in the next moment. It's not, it's complicated.
Yeah.
I think we all think a lot of mean thoughts, or at least I do sometimes. Yes?
Some of the reviews I read sort of looked at the ending like he ends up with a higher status woman, and it really kind of pissed me off, because I thought he lost his chance to have a deeper relationship with somebody who could actually be his equal, and that he was kind of settling for assuaging his ego at the end, not like going for the prize. I wonder what you thought.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes I go back and forth about how much I reveal about what I think or don't, or what's a good idea, but I can just be really candid, because I can't help it at this moment, because yes, I completely agree with you. I disagree with the reviewers who say that. But I wanted the book to feel really realistic in the ending, so I didn't want to. I wanted it to seem like the kind of thing that could happen in life, that the person the character winds up with is just someone a guy like him might wind up with. He's not like some crazy, ridiculous bimbo that just was like a punishment for him, like making him look foolish. So I felt like it was, I wanted it to ring true. I personally have some judgments about that are similar to your judgments, but I did want it to be left open enough that people could interpret the same sort of set of facts differently, just like when, we all have people in our lives who wind up with someone, we can read those relationships really differently. Is this the right person? Do they bring out the right stuff in one another? Like, I might think that my brother is married to the wrong person. This is hypothetical. He's not here. I should, but,